Welcome to Salve, a therapeutic podcast for digital ailments. We're here to ease your online aches and entrepreneurial anxieties, one session at a time, with our host Jordan Brannon and today's guest Nate Stohrer from Vertex. Today's worrying condition, the temporary blindness caused by retail taxes.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jordan Brannon, and we are here with another episode of Coalition Technology's Cyber Salve podcast, where we find cures and treatments for your digital ailments that you experience as you're trying to grow your brand through digital means. Today, we are going to be treating the temporary blindness that occurs when you aren't able to really understand and treat your tax responsibility properly. I've got a great friend of Coalition's joining us today. Nate is joining us from Vertex. Nate, welcome to the podcast. We're super excited to have you here with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Awesome. Now, could you give us a little bit of your backstory? Often when I'm talking to participants in these calls, digital wasn't necessarily the first thing that they had in mind when they got into their career, they went through college, and usually there's an interesting story there. But I'd also love to hear a little bit more about Vertex and what Vertex does and the specific value that it brings to retailers.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Nate Stohrer. I am a principal lead consultant inside Vertex's global professional services organization. So what that means is I'm providing professional services and implementation assistance to our Vertex clients. Prior to joining Vertex, I actually was in the retail industry. I worked for an international retailer based in Columbus, Ohio. I was on the IT side of the house. So I was in charge of various systems, pricing, payment, promotion applications kind of fell under my realm. And that's really where I got my first exposure to Vertex. Fast forward some years later, and I ended up saying, hey, you know what? This sounds like a great company, and was lucky enough that they wanted to have me.
Awesome. I know that for a lot of our clients, tax often actually does show up first in IT, which is sort of a funny thing in retail and in e-commerce. But a lot of that comes back to the fact that it's highly technical. How it's calculated and when it's calculated and why it's calculated is often requiring some form of software. And then trying to connect back to states and different municipalities is just a whole other layer in and of itself. We're talking today about just the sort of unknowns around tax responsibility. Can you help us understand that pain point specifically? Like, how big is it? When are retailers often becoming aware that their current approach is leading to more pain and maybe needs a little better treatment overall? What are some of the things that when you're in conversation, you just start to hear those symptoms? They're ones where you just start to think, yeah, there's a tax problem here that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, it really the first key point, I think you made a great point whenever you kind of introduced that question, was really around this idea that tax is very technical these days, right? So we've started seeing organizations spinning up these tax technology groups where it's kind of that hybrid of folks that come from more of your accounting / finance / tax background, as well as then those on more of the IT or the system side. Tax technology is growing rapidly. We're seeing more and more organizations again develop these types of groups within their organizations to be able to support the various complexities that come along with that. Tax by nature, again, is very complex. A lot of people think that it's just, rate times price, but there's actually a lot more to it than that. So when it comes to managing the rate updates, trying to keep abreast of all the changes that are coming, and there's, thousands of jurisdictions inside the U.S. alone. Every state, city, county, they all come up with their own laws. They're all changing at various points. Some are going up, very few are going down, but it does happen sometimes. We're also seeing new taxes being created. So, people are trying to say, hey, we've got a need. We need to collect some more revenue. How do we do that? Well, let's come up with a new tax. So the only way that these organizations are finding to be able to stay on top of that is really through that automation and forward facing as opposed to your reactive and your manual processes. So IT has really kind of become front and center in the tax world. You've got so many different systems that need to have tax being calculated that, you want to create that consistent experience across channels. We see it hugely inside of retail, right? That customer experience is really the backbone of the retail industry. You want your customers to feel confident and to be thinking of you, to be top of mind whenever they're going to make a purchase. So trying to make that checkout process, make that interaction with them as seamless as possible, and meeting them wherever they're choosing to shop is really a key, and tax is part of that.
Often, when I'm talking to merchants, there's a perspective that limited volume of sales and limited jurisdictions in terms of a physical presence is something of a safeguard from a lot of the tax pain. Is that actually an accurate way of looking at it, or is that just setting them up for some future pain?
So I would say that a couple of years ago, that was a very accurate statement. However, it is less so nowadays. So back in 2018, there was actually a big court case, South Dakota versus Wayfair, that took place. So kind of leading up to that, there was this historical court case that took precedence and kind of set that initial boundary. So it was designed back in the early 90s. It was called Quill.
Okay.
It was really meant to deal more with like your catalog and phone
Mm.
ordering services, right? You hit the mid 90s, the late 90s, and you start getting into this .com boom, and now everybody's got a website. Everybody's able to reach more and more customers. And so what the South Dakota versus Wayfair decision actually did then was go back and kind of modify that ruling around Quill. So now what we're seeing is that these internet sales, these digital sales that you're shipping into these jurisdictions where you don't have that physical presence, you don't have a brick and mortar store, you don't have a warehouse or something like that. Now you've got to start keeping track of how many sales you have, how many sales dollars in some states. Kind of varies from location to location, whether it's a dollar amount or a transaction threshold. But now we're seeing that you have this thing called economic
Mm.
nexus. So it's no
Mm.
longer just physical presence driving that registration and that requirement around tax calculation and remittance. You've got these digital and these internet sales as well.
One of our merchants had commented to me. They said something to the effect of they felt like a e-commerce and retail type taxes that sort of focused on that revenue nexus tended to be popular because the impact on the population of a state was maybe less obvious, and the impact on the businesses of the state were also less obvious. It was easier to point the finger and say, well, we're really aiming at getting if you're in California, we're getting, the taxes from Texas
Mhm.
businesses who are selling to California merchants. It's a way of leveling the playing field. Is that maybe part of the logic that's popular, that allows them to be politically maybe more feasible for legislative groups in all different jurisdictions to pass these and get them pushed through pretty quickly?
Yeah, I'd say there's probably two things, in my personal opinion, that kind of drive this. And the first one is exactly what you mentioned there. It's kind of leveling the playing field. Before that South Dakota versus Wayfair decision, you actually had some pretty savvy shoppers that would go out there, and tax was part of where they were choosing to shop. And I'll admit that I'm guilty of this as well. There were certain websites that they didn't have Nexus in the state where I live, and so if I ordered through them, then I was saving a little bit of money because I didn't pay tax.
Mm.
So we kind of put this, burden on the local businesses and those that were closer to their shoppers, where your prices and the end result of what the customer ends up having to pay is actually slightly higher. So it was actually ruining a little bit of that competition now that has been exposed through, the interconnectedness of our digital world, right? Everybody has an e-commerce site nowadays. You can reach anybody anywhere in the world, as long as you're ready to ship it there. Really, anyone could be your customer. So that's kind of that first factor, I think, driving that decision. It kind of made it a bit more even for folks all over the country. Everyone kind of had then the same requirements around the taxes that they were having to charge and collect, and then it was no longer this advantage to out-of-state sellers.
Okay.
The second piece of it, I think, in kind of this digital world, again, comes really around the use of the local utilities. So what we actually see then is that with all of this digital sales, you've got shipping charges, you've got things that are moving between states. They're going on trucks, they're going on ships, they're going on airplanes. Everything is kind of moving around in order to get to where it ultimately needs to go. And so what we're seeing where your, delivery companies, your FedEx, your UPS, DHL, whoever it is, they're using your public roadways. They're going around, they're having to make all of these deliveries, they're picking up returns, they're shipping returns.
Hmm.
Really what some of the states were seeing was that, well, our local infrastructure is being heavily utilized and we're not capturing anything to be able to maintain that, right? We've got all the shipping and all of these, companies that are doing business in our state, but they're benefiting by having their customers here, but they're not really giving back and helping to support why our customers are here and why they're a part of our state to begin with. So we actually started seeing some of that come into play there as well. And some states have even taken it a step further to say that they're actually going to charge these new types of taxes on deliveries.
Hmm.
So even if you're reaching those economic nexus thresholds, if you're having to collect and charge those different sales taxes in those states, there's actually additional fees on top of them that are going directly back to fund some of those public utilities like the roadways and things like that. Colorado released one of those a couple of years back. Minnesota had one. There's a few more on the docket for
Okay.
2026. We're starting to see that again as a way for states to start collecting some revenue and really be able to kind of support their local businesses and their local citizens by maintaining that infrastructure.
There's a couple of thoughts there I think that are interesting. One is, again, I think from a business owner standpoint, taxes are almost always bad, and that in some ways sort of position us to inherit more of this pain because when I'm talking to people, they often are more willing to justify tax evasion than many other things out there because government bad, me good,
Right.
that sort of simple logic. And in some ways, I think for businesses that are growing, especially through retail and in e-commerce, there's this sense of like, it's going to happen when it needs to happen and we'll figure it out then. But how often is that actually true? I think one of the just anecdotally I've heard, that sort of the there isn't necessarily an intent by a state or a jurisdiction just to shake hands with you and make right going forward. Does Vertex get a lot of conversations and calls started when someone is had that retroactive tax bill and is now being asked to open up the books for past years? Is that a frequent occurrence and a frequent place where that pain goes from being, I don't think it exists, or I think I've got it handled, to, nope, this is really a significant issue for us?
Yeah, and I would say, while that is not necessarily a retail specific issue, we see it a lot in the retail industry because
Mm-hmm.
retail moves so fast, right? You're always trying to be a step ahead of your competition. You're always trying to again gain those new customers. You're trying to keep the customers that you have. And so sometimes certain parts of the business move faster than the tax department is able to really respond. So, hey, we want to start this new selling channel and we're going to go out there and we're going to grab all these new customers and hey, just stay in your seat over there, tax, don't slow us down. We've got revenue to gain. Short term, great. Yeah, I bet you that the balance sheet looks pretty good when that happens. But kind of to your point of this question here, sometimes it does really come back to bite you. Whenever you do tax wrong, that directly is coming out of the bottom line. Your margins in retail are usually pretty slim to begin with.
Yeah.
You're trying to discount and have a promotional mix to be able to get ahead of your competitors, but you still got to make sure that those margins are being met. And so to kind of already have those slim margins, and then all of a sudden, you get hit with these fines and these fees and these retroactive charges. Well, now that balance sheet that looked good 6 months ago really isn't in your favor anymore because you moved too quickly. So yes, we absolutely do see that happening. We do work on projects where the customer comes in and says, "Hey, we had this issue under audit. We thought we were doing fine, and now all of a sudden we've got these back tax fees, and we've got to fix things going forward, and we've just got all these issues." So yeah, it is absolutely something that drives this change. And I would say again in retail with the speed at which everything is moving, the rate of growth for some of the smaller companies that are now expanding and kind of coming into the mainstream, tax kind of is this afterthought. And it's one
Mm-hmm.
of the reasons that tax technology group is really kind of key in those organizations because it does bring somebody with kind of that tax lens or that finance lens to the table whenever IT is saying, hey, the business wants to open this new website by, next month. How do we get that done? It's, well, did we think about, what does our tax integration look like? Because yeah, we'll be ready to go in 1 month, but a year from now when we go under audit, we're going to have all these fines and fees. So, getting a seat at the table, making sure that whenever you're making those business decisions that you do understand the tax impact, it not may not slow you down. Those tax professionals within your organization are going to have that visibility and that understanding to be able to come back and to be able to provide you the guidance that's necessary, so that you're not hit with these kind of fees. But definitely give them a place at the table, listen to what they have to say. Your responsibilities on more of the IT side or the system side is your area of expertise, and tax is their area of expertise.
Is technology, is that is something that is really a solution that should be thought of by bigger retailers? Or is this something that far too many small and mid-sized retailers are not paying a lot of attention to right now?
I would say that, once you kind of hit that small to medium business size, and, that in itself is maybe a little bit broad of a term, but however you would choose to define that, you're kind of moving outside of your local region. You're starting to see more online sales. Sales are picking up. That's really where that pain point starts to enter. A lot of what you would consider to be a corporate or an enterprise level organization, they've got so many systems and so many different requirements when it comes to tax that, by that point, they've got solutions in place, or they are looking and they're upgrading systems, just like you would have a big ERP or something else like that. Tax is really kind of ingrained into their processes. So it is definitely important for all size organizations, but really when you start seeing that rapid growth and you start seeing your tax liability expand beyond just, 2-3 states that you, maybe have been doing business in for years, that's really where we start seeing that pain point happen. So, there's all kinds of things that come with growing businesses, and tax is absolutely one of them to keep an eye on.
I would say, maybe even as you anticipate moving as an e-commerce brand, as you start to sell outside of your home state, whatever that is, or a place where you have physical nexus, which is often what people think about with taxes still.
Right.
We've touched on already. Like, that's the moment where you really need to be thinking about tax technology, because if you're selling and you think you're selling well in 2 to 3 states, you've already got tax exposure in 2 to 3 states. And based on my experience with a lot of different brands, it's not a matter of if the tax man comes calling, it's when he comes calling. And when he comes calling, if it's later, it's a bigger bill. We had a client recently, the interest and fees on top of the tax. I think the interest and fees themselves were 46%.
Right.
I think it was Texas specifically was coming to them and said, "Hey, we've got a handout, for a lot more than what you would have originally owed." And like you said, retail, you just don't have the margins to pick up an extra 46 points on top of that bill. So, in terms of the initial sort of moment of the starting to consider a tax technology solution, what are some of those the home remedies? What's the essential oil? If I want to dab some peppermint oil on it, like what can a small merchant who's moving into that 6-figure range, maybe has been based in a populated state and has a pretty well-defined tax law that they're familiar with, what are sort of the home remedies as they start to sell into, often we end up in the bigger population states as e-commerce brands because that's where people live and where they shop. So, as they're starting to jump jurisdictions, what is sort of that baby step maybe of a home remedy, home treatment? And what are sort of the incrementations from there?
Yeah, and I would say, take a look at what is out there. Take a look at what is in market. A lot of times the well-established tax technology groups, such as Vertex, we do have different offerings for different size businesses.
Okay.
So you definitely want to go out there. You want to get something that is right for you today, because obviously you don't want to start incurring some of that exposure that we've been talking about, because it can very quickly mount up. But you also want a solution that's going to be able to grow with you, right? Everybody's goal as part of, a business is to expand. It's to make more money. It is to reach more customers. It is to have that influence over the population. So I think that, while it is important to kind of start off and say, okay, where am I today? How do I maintain the status quo or make sure that I don't step in something and I'm able to continue to expand? You also got to think about, okay, if we're going to spend not only the time, but also the resources to put in this solution, where does this put me 2 or 3 years from now, right? What are my growth numbers looking like right now? And maybe it's that point where I'm moving from 2 states to 3 states, maybe it's 3 to 5 states, but if that holds true. If that growth continues forward, am I ready for state number 8? Am I ready for state number 32? You want to make sure that it's a solution that is going to grow with you, just like the rest of your business is going to continue to grow. So I think doing the research, kind of understanding what is out there within an ecosystem of a tax provider, making sure that there's somebody that is serving businesses very similar to you or similar to your size, and that they're able to grow to that next level, whatever you consider that next level to be based on your organization. Am I going to have to change providers in 2 or 3 years? Because then that implementation cost and that time, I'm just going to have to go through it again.
I think one of the things that I've seen with taxes, especially, is because of I see so many lookalike taxes now where someone's like, hey, Europe did this. We saw them run this tax on this product. We're going to do it in California. And then New York's like, hey, that's a really good idea. We're going to do it too. And then all of a sudden, Texas and Florida are like, hey, lovely.
Those retail delivery fees are exactly that, right?
Yep.
Colorado came out with it. Minnesota said we're following suit. And now next year, there's probably going to be 2 or 3 more.
Yep. And so it just feels like there's sort of that trickle down. I think that does speak to making that right decision early, though, because you need someone who's got the basis right, because next year there's going to be a new tax to challenge, and not to challenge, but to tackle, a new tax challenge to tackle. And you don't want to have to sort of reset, because it's not just a matter of trying to rebuild what you've already done. You don't want to be in a position where you're trying to do that and learn what's new at the same time. That really seems to compound the issues that we see. In terms of looking at some of the, maybe humor me, what state in your mind has some of the most difficult to address tax, especially for retailers, like a tax, even just the way of communicating? So I know some states are really backwater, and it's like paper filing someplace, I'm sure. But like any particular states that come to mind where you're like, if you're in the state or you're selling into the state, this is where this maybe that particular jurisdiction is especially worth bringing in a tax technology provider.
Yeah, I would say 2 states are top of mind. So probably the number 2 state I would say is California.
Okay.
It has some mildly complex rules in terms of when and where you're collecting taxes, but it's the volume of taxes. So you can actually be charged 9 or 10 different taxes on a single transaction depending on where you are in the state.
Okay.
You've kind of got this crazy nesting of jurisdictions that goes on, and they create these special tax districts just for the purpose of collecting taxes to support, like, the metros or the stadium districts, police districts, school districts, things like that. So you can have a lot of different taxes on a single transaction. But even that aside, I would say actually Colorado is probably the most complex in my mind. The reason for that has a little bit to do with the way that Colorado collects their taxes back from the retailers. So when you're actually filing your taxes there, you actually have to file with each individual city and county as well as the state. So that's a bit unique. There's only a handful of states that actually do that. So for example, in California, you may only have a single return that you're filing for all of those different taxes that you're collecting. You move into Colorado and you go from one return up to 80 or 90 because you have to file in all those different jurisdictions. They've also got some funny rules for retailers that have brick and mortar stores there. So they have these public improvement fees that are kind of unique out there. Some folks will call those like a tax on tax, which isn't technically legal. So we've actually called them fees. So you can tax these fees. But if you if you operate inside certain outlet malls or things like that, or strip malls, they've kind of created these improvement fees where it's just kind of this additional charge goes on every single transaction, and it's included as part of the sales tax as well. So they've got that going for them in addition to all the filing requirements.
All right. So we're going to mute that part so no other jurisdictions get the idea to call it a fee and then charge a tax on top of that. That's pretty prudent. So California, Colorado, we're calling you guys out. Please don't tax us. Anything additional? Maybe one other question that comes to mind is often I see, especially those emerging brands, working with just their accountant to try to solve for tax like this. And I think sometimes there's this sense that tax technology and tax support actually runs in opposition to like having an accountant. Like the two are or sort of mutually exclusive. My accountant is going to take care of this for me, or our finance department, maybe if you're a little bit larger, there's somebody there who's watching that ball. In your experience, is that the case, or is that actually maybe a way of heightening the problem?
I don't know that I would necessarily say that it heightens the problem. I would say that for some organizations that may work well. But again, you're going to hit that point where eventually it's going to spill over. Eventually, you're going to become big enough that it's not going to be able to be managed in that capacity. A lot of times what you're seeing whenever you've got just, one or two individuals that are responsible for this, the more that you grow, the more jurisdictions that you're in, the bigger your vision has to be when it comes to tracking changes, staying ahead of changes, being sure that you're ready to move into new states. A lot of that, it eventually becomes too much, right?
Mm.
And the more systems that you have, if you've got not only that e-commerce presence, but the brick and mortar presence, maybe you've got mobile, maybe you're operating in, third party marketplaces, you're selling through a marketplace, you start getting to the point where you've got too many systems to manually keep track of. You need some level of automation. You need some assistance in keeping track of those changes. You need to be able to subscribe to something that is going to be able to help you, so that you're not single threaded.
Mm.
You always talk about what happens if that individual is hit by the bus, right? Or
Mm.
what happens if they leave your organization.
Yep.
What kind of situation does that put you in? You really don't want to be stuck there. I have talked to some companies that have been in exactly that position, and they said, hey, we need this yesterday because our
Yep.
person left, and we don't have them around here anymore. So just try to be forward thinking. Obviously there's some time and some effort that goes into implementing a solution like that, but at the end of the day, whenever you can be more hands off and focus on value add activities as opposed to those maintenance, keeping the lights on,
Mm.
you're going to be providing more value to your organization then. So the ability to kind of justify, get a business case going around a tax technology solution. Most of the clients that I work with, they don't have too big of a problem justifying that type of investment.
Maybe quantify that, like when we're looking at as business owners, or in a departmental role, we're overseeing some of these decisions. Tax technology, how many hours is it saving? How many dollars is it saving? Perhaps on the fee and penalty side of things. What are some of the ways that you could kind of quantify perhaps the tax technology, just why it's a pretty simple ad. It really shouldn't be something that has a lot of discussion around it.
Yeah, so I think when you start looking at your full-time employees, how much you're spending, keeping the lights on, you take a look at that. Obviously, we're not here to replace anybody's jobs, but to be able to free you up to do other activities and to be able to add additional value to the organization. But, when you have an organization that's filing, 15, 20, 30 returns each month, you've probably got two, maybe three individuals that are responsible for that. If you're able to put in a tax technology solution that's able to automate the creation of those tax returns for you, we offer this signature ready returns program where if your data gets into our system, which we can obviously help with integrations to various, systems and platforms and things like that, you're able to produce a signature ready return at the end of the month. The
Oh.
amount of time that it takes you to prepare those filings is cut down more than in half in a lot of situations. So you no longer have to go back and try to accumulate that data, populate the forms and things like that. You're more just focusing on the reconciliation, right?
Mm.
Vertex has kind of put this number in front of you. We say, hey, based on your transactions, here's what your liability looks like for the month. Do you want to sign this? They run a couple reports just to make sure, yes, we kick the tires. These numbers appear to be correct based on what we have in our financials. Let's go ahead and sign off on that. You can do the e-filing, the mail order filing. That type of automation is really huge to be able to free up because so many tax departments spend so much time just preparing those returns in a month. If that's something you can automate and kick out, great. You've just freed up a whole ton of time.
Okay. So perhaps even just in the paperwork, not even getting to the right number, the right dollar amount, but just getting the paperwork done, there potentially could be a value that you see for the tax technology as a supplement to what your team is doing today.
Absolutely.
Looking at taxes, I think one of the big things for retail and e-commerce, because that's, again, a big focus for us, is that there's just so many nuances and layers and deviations and branches for just seemingly simple products. You already in the call, you touched on the delivery fee. You touched on where you have physical nexus, as a business, where your customer has nexus, the sort of revenue thresholds that maybe drive nexus.
Right.
And then that doesn't even touch on the type of product you're selling. I know a lot of states and jurisdictions have nuance on top of that. How often are you seeing or having conversations with retail brands where somebody added a product to the mix or did a small change on the e-commerce site and introduced a whole new set of nexus and tax obligations, maybe inadvertently? Is that something that you see happening often?
Yeah, it is. So especially during kind of those summer months and getting into the fall here, we've got these concepts of sales tax holidays, right? So back to school shopping, when you start getting into more of the fall months, it's kind of that hurricane preparedness or severe storm preparedness, things like coolers and batteries and flashlights. So you've got these specific tax laws that are focused on a subset of your products.
Hmm.
I was just working with a company a couple months ago that they expanded their offering. They were traditionally more kind of like health food and
Okay.
supplements.
Yeah.
They started selling some seed packs. So to be
Okay.
able to grow your own lettuce, peppers, whatever it may be. Seed packs that are meant for consumption have all these different tax rules associated with them, whereas previously their tax treatments across their products was very standard. So
Okay.
all of a sudden they were getting these customer complaints and things like that. The customers were smart enough to know, hey, these seed packs shouldn't be taxable where I am. Why are you taxing me? And it was kind of this whole reactive thing where it's like, oh, great, we've got this awesome idea to start selling this new product. But what we didn't realize was there's a tax liability that goes along with that. We weren't necessarily ready for that. So, trying to stay ahead of the product mix. Obviously the buyers or the merchants within your organization, they've got their jobs to do. They're going to be adding products and making sure that you guys have the inventory available to sell items where they're supposed to be. But I would say the kind of the second biggest thing in all of the projects that I work on, we talked about the first one, getting tax, kind of that seat at the table,
Yeah.
making sure tax and technology are talking to one another so you don't accidentally do something you're going to regret in 12 months under audit. But the second most important thing is really the time that you spend looking at your product catalog.
Okay.
Product level taxability is a big thing, especially in retail, because we deal with a lot of these special sales tax holidays or the special rules around things like shipping charges as it relates to the different products that you're selling. All the different states have different rules when it comes to that. So understanding your product mix, where you're selling at today and what that means may not be true tomorrow, right? When you start moving into new states, there may be all different treatments that you didn't have to deal with before.
And speaking about seasonality, Cyber Monday, Black Friday, is there added concerns for retailers during that season, especially around tax technology that maybe are worth noting right now?
Yeah, two things come top of mind. Again, kind of from my experience in the retail industry before joining Vertex, these are things that I know that we talked about and we spent months planning for kind of that holiday season. And whether that's Black Friday, Cyber Monday, or maybe you're in something like food service or quick serve restaurants, for example, and your Super Bowl Sundays,
Yeah.
February, whatever your big selling day is. I know across Asia, APAC regions, they got Singles Day, so 11/11 is a big selling one for them as well. So whatever that big show is for your organization, if tax is incorrect, everything is just going to be expounded at that point, right? It's
Mm.
going to grow exponentially. You've got sales on a regular basis, and maybe it's only a couple transactions here or there where you've got problems. Maybe they're known problems, and just you haven't been able to prioritize enough, resources to get those fixed. But when you start getting into those big selling seasons, all of a sudden, if you've got, 8 or 9 times the normal number of transactions, well, your exposure just grew 8 or 9 times to go along with that. That's kind of the first thing to keep in mind there
Okay.
as well, is that what is maybe considered a small problem for most of the year may become a very big problem very quickly during that time period.
Mm.
And the second one is kind of from a system standpoint. So again, as we talk about tax technology and being able to automate and integrate with these various systems, is your infrastructure ready to handle the increased volume of
Mm.
sales? The last thing that you want to have happen is customers on your website trying to check out and nobody can get through the checkout process. You can't collect those dollars for whatever reason. Maybe it's your website is struggling to keep up. We hope it's not your tax engine, but maybe your tax engine is struggling to keep up. Maybe it's your inventory and product system that can't, keep track of all the inventory changes. But whatever that is, you also have to make sure that your infrastructure is ready to handle that additional load as well. We are seeing a trend right now where a lot of our customers are taking kind of that cloud first approach where they're looking for hosted systems and things like that. One thing that I always like to remind my customers about is that when you use the term the cloud, what you're talking about is somebody else's computer, right?
Yeah.
So it's not yours. You don't have to maintain it. That's great. You can have that peace of mind, but somewhere there is a data center that is processing those transactions. So, is your internet connection, your connectivity, your network ready to handle that kind of traffic? So even if you've got that resiliency, and we know that we've got, auto scaling and all these great cloud technologies to go along with it to support, more of that high volume transactions, you got to be able to talk to it. You have to be able to get there first before you can actually hit those resources on that system. So making sure that, things like your store network or your e-commerce site, if that's hosted in a cloud or in your own data centers, you want to make sure that from end to end, every point of your checkout process, every point where you're going to be interacting with your customer, that has all been tested and is ready for that type of load to handle.
Really good call outs. A couple of thoughts that have kind of come to mind just listening to you speak through some of these things, specifically around that Black Friday, Cyber Monday stretch. One, you touched on earlier, that disgruntled customer on a big holiday day where you've got the countdown running on your website and they've got 10 other sites they want to shop. They're not going to take the time to email you and say, hey, your tax calculation's wrong. They're going to go pop off and look at someplace else that's similarly priced and is going to give them the right tax calc if they feel like they're going to be able to get that elsewhere. So I think that was one, and you'll lose that customer because a lot of what we do with Black Friday, Cyber Monday is not necessarily about that one sale. It's about the customer acquisition. We want to get their email. We want them to be a user of our brand's products because we know then they'll be a brand loyalist.
Right.
But if you're burning that bridge because of poor tax calculations or even just that site experience because your technology stack is not ready to do the tax calculations under higher demand, really good call outs, I think, on that particular front. And then the other one that I think is interesting is just thinking about the nature of so many of these holiday sales is we're cutting our margins deep. And earlier you touched on that. If retail margins are thin on a normal part of the year, retail margins are extra thin around Black Friday, Cyber Monday, and a mistake on the tax calculation then it may not be noticed for another year, but it really can wipe out a really good holiday season. A couple of follow-ups as we look maybe more specifically at Vertex and how Vertex fits into the market and again provides that professional treatment plan that maybe I'm not going to get from my home remedy. If you kind of gave me a little bit of a profile of a lot of diseases follow a demographic line. What's the demographic line for Vertex where if you're in this particular industry category, volume of sales, selling into these states, at what point is it really important that they get a hold of someone at Vertex?
Yeah, so I would say again, as you're having those conversations, as you're starting to move, from just a handful of states to, 5 to 10 maybe,
Okay.
Depending on which states we're talking about. Some are more complex, obviously, than others, but that's really the point where you kind of need to start thinking about, what kind of automated solution can I have here? Vertex offers, again, different kinds of solutions depending upon the size of your organization. So traditionally, Vertex has been more in that enterprise space.
Okay.
We've been working a lot more to go down market and kind of get into that small, medium business as well. So we do serve over 60% of the Fortune 500. So when it comes to the type of content, when it comes to the features and the functions that Vertex does have to offer, some of the largest organizations in the world are out there. They are using our products. They have been doing so for over 40 years. Vertex actually started as one of those kind of mail order catalog businesses back in the 70s. So when there were rate changes and rate updates, we would mail you out, a catalog of all the rate changes, and you go and key them into your system. So we've been around for a long time. We do definitely have the research teams to make sure that we are keeping staying on top of all of those different tax changes and things like that. One of the big things that I see for kind of that new to the tax technology space organization, we have a product. It's called O Series Cloud. So it is a hosted platform. You don't need any kind of software. It is in the cloud. So we are hosting that on your behalf. But you're getting all of the benefits that our enterprise customers are getting as well when it comes to that tax content, those tax changes and things like that. The tax rules and things that we build into the system, that happens across the board. So there's features and functions that are kind of focused more on that small to medium type business and are meant to kind of grow and expand with you as you kind of move and grow your business as well. We see a lot of that being kind of that choice solution, and it integrates very seamlessly with our managed services. So again, the kind of that tax filing on your behalf, the signature ready returns. A lot of our customers kind of start off in that place as well. If you're a slightly larger business, if you're maybe shopping tax technology vendors, maybe you have one today that you're looking to replace. Again, we've definitely got other service offerings as well. There's kind of something there for everybody. And I want to focus on the fact that it's also not necessarily just on that tax calculation and compliance side of things. So we do offer that end-to-end solution. Obviously calculating tax on your website or in your store is a key component of that, and then being able to remit that back to the various jurisdictions. You have to be able to do that correctly as well. Otherwise, that's where those fees and fines start coming in as well. But we also have other types of tools as well that integrate to our core solution. So we have things for managing exemption certificates. So if you do a lot of B2B type transactions, or if you work a lot with nonprofit organizations, being able to manage and to be able to track those types of exemption certificates, we have a bolt-on for our products that is able to focus specifically on that. We talked about being able to classify products correctly, knowing what it is you're selling, and to be able to comply with those different sales tax holidays, the different rules that go from state to state. We have a great tool. It's newer to the market. It's built around AI. So we have tax categorization is our tool. So it is something that can go through your product mix and try to identify how those items should be taxed, and be able to make a recommendation that your organization, it has confidence that they're doing things correctly. So we have a whole different suite of tools that could integrate depending on what it is you're looking for.
Really cool. I think that last one, AI is of course of interest to everybody, but the categorization piece I've just seen repeatedly be an issue where someone has miscategorized a tax for a particular product or group of products for a long time, and just was not aware, and even on a good faith basis, I think, felt like they had it right. And then, of course, that their particular state or municipality had some carve out that said, well, this particular thing gets treated a little bit different. So some intelligence around that can allow for some automation and say like, hey, maybe this is going to change, might actually be pretty beneficial. In terms of any promotions or offers that we can put out for our listeners today, people who are joining us, anything that Vertex has that maybe will help someone get that conversation going that they should be having already?
Yeah, so one of the big things for Vertex as well is we, again, are pretty well established within the industry. We integrate with a lot of different products. So whether that's an e-commerce platform, your ERP system, sales audit, etc. One thing that Vertex does have to offer is a lot of these pre-built connectors, or tax links as we call them. So what that does, it allows us to speed up the implementation time. So rather than having to build an integration between your e-commerce platform and our tax software, we have some that are available to purchase off the shelf. So again, we partner with a lot of the big vendors that are out there. If you are using, one of the big names kind of in the e-commerce industry, there's probably a Vertex tax link or a tax connector available. So kind of asking about, what is there? How can we get to market quicker? Can we be ready for this upcoming selling season? That's definitely going to go a long way in being able to kind of get you there and making sure that you are compliant in time to deal with that increase in volume and potential increase in exposure.
Awesome. Nate, I appreciate your expertise and deep insights here to the tax pain point that we began with. If you are out there and, again, you've been running blind, maybe soloing as sort of your approach to tax, even if you're in a department where taxes is sort of falling under your purview, naturally, I would really encourage you to reach out to Vertex. Again, just that there are a few things in life that are certain. Death and taxes is one of them. I'd add a third. That's taxes is way more complex than you think it is. And Nate and Vertex are there to help you out. So Nate, again, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Awesome. All right. We'll be back soon with another episode of Cyber Salve, where we look to cure your digital pain points and ailments by bringing some of the best experts in particular areas of practice and support just to help you navigate some of those challenges. Bye, everyone.